And we're back. So after yesterday's video, which I recommend that you watch for a little more context, I wanted to look at the strategic goals of the United States and the big points that I think they're being missed in the recent hysteria about Trump directly negotiating with Russia, more specifically Marco Rubio in the State Department and his team in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, negotiating with the Russians without the Ukrainian involvement, without the European Union being involved. And as I mentioned in my previous video, the EU leaders, especially Germany, led to the war by supplying Russia with tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of euros in payment for cheap Russian energy. So why is everyone up in arms? There's a lot of hyperbole about how Trump is like a Neville Chamberlain, how Ukraine is being carved up, how Europe is on the brink again of war because of Trump, and that he's naive and that he's selling Ukraine out and whatnot. And as I mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of factors involved. One of them is personality. Of course, Trump takes things personally if you attack him. And all Europe was doing over the last at least 5 years, but close to 10 years, basically, since he began his first presidential campaign, is to criticize Trump, to spit on Trump, to call him a fascist, to call him an idiot, to call him all sorts of things. And this was especially the case the last few years when he was out of power, especially after 2021 and the January 6th, mostly peaceful protest outside the U.S. Capitol. He was demonized in every which way, but then the tables turned because he won the presidency again last year in November, and now everyone has been trying to suck up to him in the interim. But I think that honeymoon period has worn off. And in any case, if you've been a jerk to someone for years, and suddenly they are in a position of power that can either benefit or hurt you or both, sucking up to them, for the past 5 minutes is not going to change their perception of you. And I think that's the problem that EU leaders are running into, that especially Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is running into. And you don't just back out of it and get what you want because you start singing a different tune. So this shows the importance of long-term thinking and acting in a diplomatic way, even outside the normal channels of diplomacy. When we talk about diplomacy, it's not just ambassadors interacting with elected officials. It could be on an individual level of business leaders and other people interacting with even normal people, not necessarily people in high positions of authority, but you'll be amazed at how many low-level or mid-level staffers in various organizations, public and private, have access to these other people, and how your impression on them makes a big difference. And this applies especially towards Poland, which I have a special interest in. I'm sitting in Poland right now, and I've seen the ineptitude of Polish diplomacy and just the weakness of it over the years on both sides, but especially now. Poland is in an exceptionally weak position right now because of the stupidity of its leadership and the attacks on Trump, and just basically being a lapdog for Germany and other EU interests at the expense of maintaining good relations with the Americans on both sides of the political aisle. And Trump can almost be considered like a third side or piece of the pie of the political aisle, because he has gone beyond definitely the Democrats, of course, and beyond even the traditional Republican establishment. The old guard Democrats and Republicans were much more in line on foreign policy and the way things were done. A legacy of the Cold War, but we are in a new era. Of course, some of the same paradigms are repeating themselves, especially with Putin and Russia's expansionism. But unlike the Cold War, America does not have the luxury of focusing its attention on one enemy and one flashpoint on the international scene. So America does not have that luxury because Russia is an ongoing adversary, although much weakened from its Cold War days. China, of course, is a major adversary, although I think, I think there's room to work there. I was speaking with a, you could say acquaintance for now, that I met recently, and he spoke about something that I hadn't heard of. Apparently when President Xi of China was in Poland several years ago, he made reference to a Polish pilot, I believe his last name is Abramowicz, who fought with Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers. These were Allied pilots who fought on behalf of China against Japan in World War II. And Xi used that as a touch point for Polish and Chinese relations. That's another subject to get into as far as what can be done there. But I think that talk of a war and major conflict between China and the United States is premature, and a lot of it ties into the interests involved, and I don't think the intentions of these people making these proclamations are pure and honest, or at least clearly thinking. I think they're going along with the flow, and I think, of course, everything should be done to avoid conflict between China and the United States. But expanding on what the thread that I started, there's the challenges of the U.S.-China relationship, ongoing problems with Russia. Even a weaker Russia, you still have to deal with it. You have the problems in the Middle East, especially between Israel and Iran and its proxies, which is something, unfortunately, the U.S. can get sucked into too easily, and that's another issue that we're going to have to expand on, because I think of the three, the situation with Russia and Eastern Europe and Europe generally, China, and the Middle East. The Middle East is the least directly damaging to the United States for various reasons. It's mostly a matter of Israel's influence on U.S. foreign policy that has pulled us, and the historical relationship built following World War II and the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel and all of that. But we will get into that another time. In any case, the U.S. can't afford to fight multiple battles, whether hot or cold, on multiple fronts at the same time. Dr. Tom Henriksen, who I helped edit a book of his on U.S. foreign policy some years ago, wrote about the tick-tock element in U.S. foreign policy, that the U.S. goes from times of greater engagement and involvement in world affairs to being not necessarily isolationist, but more withdrawn and focusing on internal matters. And I think we definitely are in a period like that, where the U.S. is more focused on its internal affairs and the problems with its economy and the matters that most concern citizens, immigration, of course. So Trump and his administration are looking for places where they can save money, where they can de-escalate potentially explosive situation. And that comes at the expense of the parties that are directly involved and have a vested interest. Of course, Ukraine has an interest in maintaining its territory and recovering as much as it can, although I think we're seeing that that is not going to be possible. So Poland is a little bit more removed, but still it's next door to Ukraine. It sees Ukraine as a buffer against Russian aggression in the future. Of course, Poland has experienced tremendous aggression from Russia in the past, so that's something that's on everyone's mind. Security for Poles is a top issue, although even though it's a top issue, it's amazing that Polish politicians can't find common ground, and they don't seem to be on the same page across parties as far as the importance of that security and what should be done about it. But what I wanted to do, going back to what I started with, the strategic interests of the United States and of EU and let's say NATO more specifically, because NATO was established to protect against Russia. And I must add, you know, one of the, it wasn't part of its founding documents, but one of the, I believe it was the first Secretary General of NATO referred to NATO's mission as keeping Russia or the Soviet Union out, keeping the Americans in Europe, and keeping Germany down, because Germany had facilitated 2 world wars, started 2 world wars in the 20th century, and was seen as a major factor in destabilizing and destroying, through that destabilization, Europe. So I think NATO still has that role to play. But going back, you know, there is all this talk now about carving up Ukraine and whatnot, and Trump is selling out and whatever. Let's go back to December 2021. And I actually did a video on this almost exactly 2 years ago. So I will put a link up here for you to check that out. Please do check that out, where I talk about the list of demands that Russia issued in December of 2021 to de-escalate the situation. And among them was the ban for Ukraine to enter NATO, and I think that's probably going to be a top thing that will be offered to Russia, or is offered already to Russia. Ukraine entering NATO was never a priority for the West. I think it has become more so for people with certain interests that aren't necessarily tied to the legitimate security interests of Europe, but they benefit from defense contractors, from think tanks that are funded by defense contractors. There's a lot of people who claim to be, or are presented as experts by the mass media, who are not looking out for your best interests. I'm talking to American citizens, I'm talking to Polish citizens and other European citizens. So don't be so quick to swallow what an expert is selling you. Look at who funds them, look at who is promoting them, and then you'll have an idea of what their angle is in all of this. And among the other demands that Russia put forward was to remove any NATO troops or weapons to deploy to countries that entered the alliance after 1997, which of course would include Poland and much of Eastern Europe. So the question that we have to ask is whether it's more important for Ukraine to maintain certain borders, or for NATO to maintain its integrity in the face of Russia's demands, because these demands are still on the table. So I think a much more accurate way to assess whether Trump's negotiations are successful or not is how much of these demands that were already made 3 years ago, and which will certainly return to the forefront, are met. And if Trump criticizing Zelensky, you know, calling him a dictator and that Ukraine started the war, which is not the case, although it's more complicated than simply saying that Russia invaded and Ukraine was a colony of Russia for generations. It became independent in the early 90s. Its borders were established by the Soviet Union. Ukraine did not fight for their borders and establish their borders. They did not fight, they did not tear their independence away from Russia in a natural way, you could say. A lot of that had to do with the Soviet Union collapsing, and for certain realities to be established with the ongoing relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine was seen as a part of Russia, or has been seen, it still is seen as very close to Russia, and that's why Putin went forward and invaded Ukraine. It doesn't legitimize his invasion, but there's important historical context that's missing. There's a huge Russified population in Ukraine. Prior to the war, the majority of Ukrainians were using Russian on a day-to-day basis. They identified closely with Russia. There are tons of Ukrainians with Russian or half Russian or partially Russian family members, or Ukrainians living in Russia, and very much culturally there's a great closeness there. So it's not as if Putin invaded Finland or Norway, where the culture is much different and he just wanted to grab the land. This is something that we'll get into even more in another video, but I think this is something that needs to be considered, that Putin invading Ukraine was not some crazy thing, that there were historical reasons why Putin would do that. And it's, like I said, it's not to legitimize what he did, but we're trying to understand why he did it and why Russia over the centuries has engaged in an expansionist foreign policy. So this isn't unique to Putin, but that context is never provided by the experts, at least the ones that we see in the mass media. So this demand is a non-starter, of course, to basically dismantle NATO, all the NATO countries that were established after 1997, and I don't see that happening. So that's an important thing that is, if we start seeing talk about this, then I would be worried. That's when you should be worried, not with Ukraine's far eastern border. So Ukraine not getting into NATO, I think that's probably a given. The reason why Ukraine was not seriously considered for NATO prior to the outbreak of this hot portion of the war over the last 3 years is that it was engaged in conflict with Russia. So of course you're not going to have a country that's at war with your main adversary. The whole point of the alliance being created to protect against Russia. You're not going to bring someone in who's at war with Russia, therefore automatically triggering the alliance's war with that country, the nuclear armed and unpredictable country. So no, I don't see that happening. There's also talk about, withdrawing missile systems and things. So it's kind of a, return to the Cold War diplomacy. But the main demand was basically for NATO to dismantle its eastern flank, which is not going to happen unless something dramatic happens. But that, I don't see Trump doing that. I don't see the purpose of that. It would undermine American security because it would create more of a just an invitation for Putin, not necessarily to invade, because a lot of this talk about invasion is overblown. Ukraine was invaded because it was not a part of NATO, large Russified population, especially in the east, the parts that will most likely go to Russia under this whatever ceasefire or peace, whatever they call it. Historical ties, and like I said, the fact that it's not militarily allied formally with the United States, NATO, and Europe, the EU, not a part of the EU. So it was something that Putin could foreseeably have consumed and integrated into Russia. He probably regrets not doing it 10 years ago, or now 11 years ago now, because I think he would have succeeded then. The population back then, when he took Crimea and the Donbass, slowly began this, or rapidly, I guess you can say 10 years or 7 years is rapid, up to 2022, began to gain a much stronger sense of its national identity. More, it's like a double-edged sword, but it's terrible with the invasion, but it also crystallized Ukrainian national identity more than any other event in Ukrainian history. So as terrible as it is, and I've heard it said before that this war with Russia is kind of like Ukraine's war of independence, like how the U.S. tore away from the British Empire. And the cost of this independence looks to be about 20% of its territory. And the next thing I wanted to go to here is a map of Ukraine. This is from February 2025. And so the red on the eastern half here is what Russia occupies, including Crimea. The blue is what Ukraine recovered, so it's basically the furthest extent of the Russian advance. And as I mentioned in the last video, I gave a talk back in last May, and there have been advances, of course, by the Russians. They're making progress. The Ukrainians don't have the infantry to resist. But the advances have also not been dramatic. It is still roughly hovering around 20% of the country is under Russian control. Assuming the conflict stopped today, Ukraine would lose a substantial part of its territory, although not a critical mass that I think would undermine its nationhood. I think it can survive as a nation. As I mentioned before too, the population has dramatically declined. Of course, many people were killed tragically, soldiers and civilians, but the majority of the decline in population is from people leaving the country because they don't see a future there, especially in a country where war is never ending, and 3 years is a long time for war, especially in a country that's fighting an aggressor that is disproportionately stronger and larger than they are, and they're also relying on outside support to survive. So they can't do this forever. And just for a historical comparison here, so here you have the areas taken by Russia. Of course, Ukraine still has access to the Black Sea, which is very important. The size of the country is larger than Poland, so it's and the question is whether the current population can even sustain this size of country. Ukraine's demographics are also not going in a good direction, neither is Russia's, but it's not so much about land anymore. It's what you can do on that land. It's there's a lot of agriculture, but there's also a lot of unused land in Ukraine, and the question is, what can you do to attract people back, primarily to the cities? I mean, I don't think people are going to come back and farm, but you need them to come back and to pay into your system. The U.S. has been funding billions of dollars every month to pay the pensions of Ukrainian civil servants. I mean, this goes well beyond military assistance. But then to make a historical comparison here, let's take a look at the map of what happened to Poland at the end of World War II. Of course, Poland received no aid, no military aid. During the war, it was a trickle for the underground compared to Greece or to France. But the Polish World War II underground was the most important underground organization during World War II. It provided all kinds of intelligence to the Allies. It did sabotage operations, and it comprised several 100,000 active members, but it did not receive aid because the desire was not to antagonize Stalin. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt and his naive, left-leaning, liberal, proto-globalist administration thought that after the war, within the confines of the United Nations, the United States and the Soviet Union would basically control the world. The two major powers would hold the most sway over the world, so he didn't want to antagonize Stalin. Ultimately, Poland, of course, was sold out completely. There was no international traveling by the Polish president like Zelensky has done over the last 3 years. There were no tens of billions of dollars in aid, in sophisticated weapons to help Poland resist Russia taking over its territory. So here you have, in this reddish, brownish color, pre-war Poland. So this is what Poland looked like from 1918 to 1939. And then the German invasion happened September 1st, 1939, and then the Russian invasion September 17th, 1939. But then after, of course, the Germans invaded Russia in June of 1941, and then the Russians fought back with tons and tons and, billions of dollars in U.S. support and weapons, U.S. Jeeps and all kinds of material was used to not just beat back the Germans by the Red Army, but to take over Poland and to cut Poland in half, basically. So the eastern territories of Poland, the eastern you could call this the borderlands. I mean, it's more than just borderlands. It was a huge part of Poland was taken, the most fertile agricultural lands, the historic cities of Lvov, now Ukrainian Lviv, and Vilnius, what was called Vilna then, still is called by the Poles. And Poland lost all this territory. They were compensated with former German territory, but I'm sure the Poles would be happy to have this back. There's no talk of recovering these lands. That was also Russian propaganda that the Poles want to take back Lvov and Vilna, but that's not going to happen. It's not even within the realm of Polish thinking. It's not pragmatic at this point, and it's a terrible loss, though. It's something that is never discussed publicly, how Poland was cut apart. So Poland was carved up at the end of World War II, received no aid, and we recovered. We were under communism for 50 years. We didn't have any special deal where, okay, you'll lose 20% of your land, but you'll have free elections, you'll have everything, you know, here you'll have international support and investments. No, none of that. It was just given away to Stalin. And now you have the borders here of modern day Poland. So in history, you can lose a lot and you still survive. And I think that's the next stage for Ukraine, is to make the most of what they have. But this business of Ukraine being carved up, I don't buy it at all. Here you have from the unfortunate Drudge Report, which I mentioned yesterday, is not a really good site anymore, but at least it gives you a flavor of the mass media angle that is being pushed here. Putin on the brink of victory. Of course, he's not on the brink of victory of taking over all of Ukraine, just some kind of negotiated settlement. Europe back to 1938. No, I don't think we're back to 1938, because I don't think Putin is on the verge of invading Europe. It's not impossible, but it would just be suicidal. Worried NATO holds drills. So the foundation of NATO is the United States. And I don't know who's worrying, but the worry has been that NATO is all on the U.S.'s dime, on the U.S. taxpayers' dime, while Europe not only doesn't contribute as much as they should, especially Germany and other Western European countries, but they facilitated Putin's drive to take over Ukraine by feeding him tens of billions of euros, buying his cheap energy. And they want to do it again. So it's sort of an empty thing that NATO is worried. I think they're referring to other NATO countries, but again, NATO exists because of the United States. If there's a war with Russia, it all depends on the United States whether the alliance will successfully defend itself against Russia. Let's just look at one of these things here. We have an article, the one that talks about Ukraine ready to be carved up. And then you ask, who says it's carved up? And you see an expert has said. So, okay, an expert, so it's automatically legitimate. We have to believe it. And then you have to dig into the article, and the expert is Professor Inderjeet Parmar, who I have never heard of, but he is a professor of international politics at City University of London, affiliated with a standard media outlets, CNN, BBC. Okay, expert, try to understand who this is, why they're saying what they're saying, where their interests lie, who funds his seat at the City University of London. And just use your own judgment. I mean, maybe he has something good to say there, but from what I see, it's easy to find someone that you get a soundbite from, and then you shape it to your own narrative. So is this Ukraine being carved up? If, assuming this land that Russia took since 2022 becomes Russian territory, and the Russian Federation borders encompass those lands, and then the rest stays as Ukraine, and Ukraine stays an independent country, and Ukraine gets billions and billions in aid continuing now to, to rebuild, does that mean Ukraine has been carved up? And then you compare it again to what happened to Poland. All of this gone, no compensation, no international negotiations, just the Yalta conference where this was basically, actually the Tehran conference in Iran in 1943 was more significant. And then Yalta in 45 basically just put a rubber stamp on it, like, yep. Although there will be free elections and everything, but there were no free elections, there was no compensation. The Marshall Plan partially affected Poland early on, but then the Soviets cut that off. So there was no rebuilding Poland. There is no goodwill towards Poland, or was no goodwill towards Poland then, like there is towards Ukraine now. So I wouldn't buy into the hysteria that Ukraine is being carved up and sold. Like I said, looking at the strategic interests of the United States and of NATO, the emphasis should be on maintaining NATO integrity. Recall that Finland and Sweden joined NATO, so NATO has expanded since 2022. Two very good allies to have in NATO, and I think two allies that Poland should work more closely with, because it seems like Sweden and Finland are more pragmatic. Of course, they have more to lose. They're on the Baltic, Finland borders Russia, and they're serious about defending their countries, unlike Germany, because Germany's defense involves Poland being the buffer. So have no illusions about whether, if Poland is attacked or there's aggression towards Poland, and the decision is between maintaining economic relations with Russia or some kind of conflict with Russia. Germany will sell Poland down the river. There are already plans in Poland, apparently, that the defensive plans for Poland are to withdraw all forces west of the Vistula River. So basically cutting the country in half, and the Vistula roughly runs here. So Poland would lose, a third of its territory, according to these plans on day one of a potential Russian attack. But I think we're far from that, and I wouldn't buy into the hysteria. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining me, and I will talk to you later. Signing off from Warsaw, this is Nick.